Great question. It's a privilege to have time to exercise. It's a privilege to have the ability to afford a gym membership. It's a privilege to be able to fit into gym machines. It's a privilege to know what to do in a gym. It's also a privilege to live in the vicinity where a gym is. If you saw one of my last videos, I talk about how gyms are built in certain affluent areas. It's a privilege to be able to get outside into a safe neighborhood and walk or jog. It's a privilege to be able-bodied enough to exercise. It's a privilege to be able to afford the right clothes to exercise in. It's a privilege to be able to easily find clothes that fit you to exercise in. It's a privilege to not feel intimidated when walking into a gym. It's a privilege to not feel like you shouldn't be somewhere just because of your size or your gender. And it's also a privilege to have the time, the access, or the money to cook so-called health foods. So yeah, it's a privilege.
Let's say that fat person you're commenting on does have a binge eating disorder. Let's say they do overeat. Do you think your comment is going to help them out? Do you think it's going to be really helpful in their recovery? Do you think you're telling them something they haven't already heard? What kind of audacity does that take?
What is your favorite thing that thin people do that's like quirky, cute?
Being unwashed or just smelling bad in general. I was so furious when all the celebrities were like, I only bathe my children once a week, because it just reeks of thin privilege. If you are ever in a public space and there is a distinct smell happening, 9 times out of 10, everyone will assume that that smell belongs to whoever the fattest person in the room is. There was a time where I was straight up in an elevator where I watched a thin woman like twist her whole body and rip ass and start giggling, and everyone in the elevator looked at me. It is just assumed that fat people smell, and that's not true. And then when thin people are caught as like the source of the smell, it's always like, oh, I'm getting in touch with my body. I'm trying to be a little bit more all natural. Or people laugh it off and they're like, oh, I guess you forgot to wear deodorant today. But if like a fat person forgets to wear deodorant one day, it's a reflection of our entire existence.
Say it again. Fat girls with skinny faces have privilege.
100%. I completely agree with this. As a plus size model, I've been on both sides of the spectrum. In January, I got diagnosed with a really rare blood disease, and they are treating it with prednisone. One of the things is prednisone, and it's making me have a bunch of water retention. So now I have this, and I have indentions here from my cheeks being puffy, and my eyelids are swollen a lot. And so, I have noticed that there are some companies and brands that only deal with plus size models that have really thin faces. Now, on top of that, I've had a bunch of other smaller brands and companies reach out to me for me to start modeling for them, because now I look more plus size. Whereas before, I guess it was kind of a toss up. I'm still a size 26 either way. But yeah, it's weird.
Let's talk about thin privilege, since you seem to think it doesn't exist. Thin privilege is posting a dance video on this app and not getting a bunch of comments about how you should exercise more or change your diet. Thin privilege is sitting down on a bus or an airplane and not being afraid that you're not going to fit into the seat. Thin privilege is walking into a clothing store and knowing that you will physically fit inside of the clothing. Thin privilege is going out in public and being able to eat and not be criticized by passers-by for eating. Thin privilege is a very real and harmful thing that we all have to work to combat. And that starts with not using fat as a derogatory term.
Do y'all remember when people got upset that I put 3 scrambled eggs instead of 2 into my breakfast hash that I ate? And people went wild about it? Thin privilege, fat phobia, you're welcome.
Emily Mariko has recently posted some videos of her going to In-N-Out to get fast food. And I was really curious what the comment section would look like on her videos. But to my surprise, after scrolling through hundreds of comments, I couldn't find anyone saying anything negative about what she was eating. In fact, people were praising her for normalizing eating fast food and helping them with their eating disorders. Now bear in mind, Emily Mariko is very thin. A few days before I saw that video, I had posted a video of me eating out at Burger King, explaining that you can go out to a fast food restaurant while you're on a weight loss journey and still lose weight. As long as you're eating in moderation, it's fine. And keep in mind, I am not thin. People lost their shit in my comment section. And people say thin privilege isn't real.
Let's talk about thin privilege. Thin privilege is defined as the power and advantages systematically accorded to people with thinner and smaller bodies. Some examples of thin privilege include not being denied medical care because of your weight, airlines not charging you more money to fly, and being more likely to get a raise or promotion than your fat counterparts. As well as everyday, seemingly mundane things, like being able to comfortably fit into public transit seats and even hospital gowns. A lot of people have argued that thin privilege isn't real because thin people have also experienced body shaming for being too thin and have body image issues like everybody else. But as Christy Harrison beautifully put, having thin privilege doesn't mean that you've never had any body image issues or that you've never struggled with disordered eating or that you've never been bullied or shamed by people for your size. Fatphobia goes beyond bullying. It includes being dehumanized and systematically ignored and discriminated against in healthcare, education, employment, you name it. As a small fat who is also white, I experience both thin privilege and white privilege. Therefore, even though I may get some rude messages or comments about my body, I'm still seen as a more acceptable level of fat than someone, for instance, who's a mid-fat or super fat. And if you don't know what mid-fat or super fat means, here is a helpful infographic of the fatness spectrum. Of course, as with everything, intersectionality is super important. Somebody like me, who's a white small fat, will have a vastly different experience than someone who is both black and a super fat, and vice versa. The experiences we have are completely different, as well as the way we are perceived and treated in the world. And I absolutely benefit from thin privilege. I know that as a size 16, I can go to the doctor and I'm more likely to have my symptoms taken seriously. I can semi-comfortably fit in an airplane seat, and I know that I have the benefit of living in a white society where I have never experienced racism. The treatment of fat people gets worse once you consider things like size, race, gender, and income. Thin privilege highlights the systemic disparity in the treatment between fat people and non-fat people. And because people usually get really angry whenever thin privilege or privilege in general is mentioned, this is not an attack on thin people. This is a critique of the fat phobia that's embedded within society and how fat phobia pervades life in seemingly trivial, mundane ways. Take some time to think about how you might benefit from or be harmed by thin privilege, and how you might perpetuate fat phobia in your daily life.
We talk about thin privilege, and this is a really good example. So I am making my breakfast, and I have a piece of pizza from Domino's left that I didn't finish last night, and it sounded really good, so I'm eating it. Because I exist in a smaller body, you're probably like, wow, good for her. Like, she has food freedom, she doesn't restrict herself, she doesn't say pizza's only a dinner food, things like that. But now I want you to think, if I was in a bigger body, would you still be thinking the same things? Would you still say, good for her? Or would you say, are you sure you want to eat that? Something to think about.
Thin privilege is a joke. If you're fat and unhappy about it, change yourself. Why don't you change yourself? Let's start there. Because the main reason people who are overweight are unhappy is because people like you shame them just for existing. They're not the problem. You're the problem.
What it's like shopping in the mall as a plus size person. They don't carry my size. They don't carry my size. They also don't carry my size. I can't shop here. Nothing in my size here, or here, or here.
Guys, do you remember the time when I posted an almost identical video to this? But I was told that I should avoid potatoes. I was given unwanted and unsolicited health advice when I was minding my own business, just making a cooking video. But I was told that I needed to avoid potatoes. Do you remember that? Do you remember how fat people and thin people are not allowed to exist in the same way on the internet? You remember that? Again, no hate to this guy. I have no issue with him, and I don't hate him. I'm also not mad at him either. I am using his video as an example to compare how thin people and fat people are not treated the same way. So.
For my wild exercise, I choose this brownie. It's such a workout.
Oh my god, this is so cute. Oof. Hauling my big butt around on this couch. How cute is that? How cute. Yeah, this would not work as a thigh high. There's not enough. Not enough. However, if they did make a bigger one day for the super, super big thighs, 100% would buy.